just going to put in my own personal plug, because if there is another organization which is doing so much to preserve our Boston waterfront and our access as citizens to the waterfront, I don't know who it would be other than the Conservation Law Foundation. We're getting to the end of the year. People are looking for places to make donations for charitable purposes. I would like to encourage you to think about the Conservation Law Foundation if you are looking for someplace to make a donation. I'm certainly intending to do so. So, Victor.
Thank you, Mary, for the privilege of introducing Peter Shelley. Peter Shelley is now Senior Counsel at the Conservation Law Foundation of Massachusetts and has served as Vice President and Director of CLF. Let me jump, that comes from the website of the Conservation Law Foundation, which you can all look at and get more information about Peter Shelley. But let me jump to an article that was published in the Globe on May 27th of this year, which says various things, some of which I will read. For half of his lifetime as a lawyer for the Conservation Law Foundation, the fight to clean up America's dirtiest harbor was the engine that propelled him. Peter Shelley is, to a great extent, responsible for Boston Harbor being clean. After $4.5 billion of public money was spent to fix broken pipes, to stop illegal dumping, to turn what had been a toilet into a treasure, Peter Shelley says the public is systematically being walled off from the harbor it paid to clean up, and so forth. I commend you to this article on May 27, 2017 in the Boston Globe. To make it short, I would like to introduce him as the hero of the harbor and ask Peter Shelley to tell us.
There are literally so many other thousands of people who equally could deserve that accolade, but I'm really happy to be here tonight. After these boring talks about fires and local politics, I know you're all really excited to hear about the law, which is, and I don't know how much time I have actually, so.
You'll throw us out at 9, so.
Oh, okay. So, a couple of things I want to talk about, and it comes from my experience that people are very respectful of other people's boundaries and private property, and certainly in the North End, those issues are intensified, so it's important, I think, to understand where the private rights intersect with the public rights around the waterfront. As Victor said, we have spent on the order of maybe $24 billion public dollars to clean up the harbor. That was about $5 billion to do the greenway, to put the highway underneath the ground so that you could connect the city back to the water, to build the convention center, to put in the Silver Line, you know, like all these huge public investments. And what has been happening recently is that a number of private developers, being very smart, have recognized that this is a pretty valuable piece of property now and have started to capture this value that the public really has created. Just to give you one example, Morgan Stanley got a chunk of property in the Seaport area, held it, got some permits for it, and then flipped it to a developer and walked out of Boston with $300 million in profits. So that gives you some sense of what the private profits are from this. And it's, in order to understand this, there are two legal doctrines that I just want to mention because they're really important. One, and they're both very ancient doctrines, so this is nothing new when you're looking for your public rights. This is nothing new. The first was really recognized by the Emperor Justinian back 500 before the current time. Of course.
I have a curfew.
I'm really,
I have a curfew.
I sundowned about half an hour ago too, so.
Who called and get me home.
Okay,
I'm
okay,
supposed
well-
to be out.
Please, not on my account. So back at that time, he recognized that the public had a natural right to the shorefront and the waterfront and to fish, and that has been almost a continuous legal principle since before the Justinian Code was passed. That came down through the Magna Carta. It came to the colonies by the English settlers, and the king used to own everything in Boston that was below the high water mark. And if you, for those of you who haven't looked at a historic colonial map of Boston, north end was pretty high. I mean, there were probably some areas that were above the high water mark around here. But most of Boston, a lot of Boston, almost all the way to the base of Beacon Hill, Sir Faneuil Hall, all that, was tidelands, mud flats mostly. And the colonists wanted to get maritime commerce. They wanted to get people to bring ships in, but the ship owners couldn't bring them in because there was tidal flats. They couldn't get, much beyond probably where Hull is now before they started to run into this, some tidal flats. So the colonists asked the king, and the king agreed to convey the land between the high water mark and the low water mark to the upland property owner, in return for that property owner agreeing to build wharfs and warehouses and other kinds of infrastructure so that ships could come and maritime commerce could exist in Boston. The other part of that deal was that when that land was conveyed, the king's land, our land right now, was conveyed to those upland landowners, the public's right to access those lands was preserved. So there is a permanent easement that's attached to every piece of land in Boston, and in fact in Massachusetts, that is below the once historic high water mark, that the public has rights, legally recognized rights of access and use of for fishing, fowling, and you have to sort of imagine this as a fiction. I mean, no one navigates in those areas anymore with a boat, but the fiction now is that you can navigate by foot or by bike or with a stroller or whatever. So that's continued till today. And those are called the tidelands. And you've heard a lot about that. And that's not just the water you see. Below the low water mark, a lot of Boston that's built now is below the low water mark. And that was filled, flowing water. And those are called Commonwealth tidelands. And those are the most protected of all the tidelands because they were not conveyed to those private property owners. They were always public lands. Some of those were filled also. A lot of the Seaport District is in that category. And those lands are also have significant public interests that are associated with them, even though they may be owned by a private entity or a private property owner. They're not owned, what's called in the real estate terms, fee simple. You don't own all the sticks associated with that property. You own some of them, but the public owns a lot of them still. The other doctrine that's a long-standing one is called the prior public use doctrine. And that's a doctrine, again, that's gone up to the Supreme Court many times, which basically says once a piece of property is in public ownership, it can't be conveyed into private hands except for a proper public purpose. So the state is prohibited from actually unloading all this land without these restrictions on private property owners. And the doctrine goes on to say that if those public purposes, say this maritime commerce I was talking about, if that's no longer viable, then the legislature has to change and identify a new public purpose that those lands are supposed to be used for, or those lands go back to to the people. They go back to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This is all well-established sort of stuff you learn in law school. Although the people who own the lands won't tell you this if they know about it. So what happened in the 70s and 80s, what actually happened in the 50s, how many were here in the North End in the 50s? Anyone?
Yeah.
So after the Navy was a big presence in Boston Harbor for a long time after World War II. They abandoned a lot of their facilities after the war. They stood down a lot of the stuff. The BRA at that point picked up a lot of this property that was former government-owned Navy land, maritime commerce use. The BRA picked it up for redevelopment. And a number of course, at that time, the harbor was a sewer. So no one was really building near the harbor. You know, the only exceptions at that time were harbor towers. They were really the first kind of brave soul, I guess, to put a building up on the harbor. The aquarium came shortly after that. Faneuil Hall came a little bit later, but that was about it for a long time in terms of any development on the harbor.
Was that the 70s?
What?
Was that the 70s?
60s actually, with the harbor tower and the aquarium. 70s, and Faneuil Hall I think was 60s too. But remember, we had the central artery and central artery on that side, sewer on the other. So it was really a wasteland. But it was a public wasteland. It was still this property with public interest.
Well, excuse me, on
yeah.
Atlantic Ave where Columbus Park is now, those are all fish houses and ice houses.
Right, okay, so that's a maritime use.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that around the harbor, and those were consistent with what those lands had been given to private owners to do. But then in 1978, a case went up to this SJC involving Lewis Wharf, of all places. I mean, Lewis Wharf is now notorious again for different reasons, but it was the case on which the state Supreme Court sort of declared what was going to happen with all these tidelands. And the Supreme Court, the SJC said, listen, founding fathers probably couldn't have anticipated this back then. You know, condominiums, the concept hadn't even been invented yet, let alone imagined it. I mean, they didn't have this in mind. The whole doctrine up until this point in time had been based on fish houses, things that had to be on the water, being on the water. And the SJC basically told the legislature that you need to come up with a new public purpose for the development of those lands if they're not going to be used for maritime commerce. And so that's where Chapter 91 came from in the 70s. And that was the legislature's effort to modernize this doctrine of balancing a public purpose against private development that would be non-water dependent. So, and Chapter 91 has really two parts to it. One is if you're going to put in something on the waterfront on former tidelands, again, remember that could be Faneuil Hall, it could be Fenway. I mean, Fenway was all tidelands. If you're going to put in a marina or something that's called water dependent, is the new word they use, then because of this long-standing tradition, it would be assumed that your development was serving a proper public purpose because it was consistent with this long tradition. But if you were going to put in a non-water dependent use or structure, such as a hotel or an apartment building or anything that didn't have to be on the water, you had to demonstrate, you as the developer, in order to get approval, had to demonstrate that your project, that the public benefits associated with your project were greater than the public detriments. And that's a little bit confusing, but the public detriments in this case are someone putting a building in so you can't navigate or walk on these public tidelands anymore, privatizing essentially this space. So those are the developer has to demonstrate that the public benefits are greater than the public detriments associated with the development. And the second thing they have to do, if they're developing on Commonwealth tidelands, these very special lands, is that they have to demonstrate that private benefits are secondary. The court said incidental. The private benefits associated with the development are supposed to be just incidental. And so that's what we've been living with ever since. DEP came up with a number of very specific regulations. From the late 80s to the early 90s, there were two, our organization was involved with both of these massive rulemaking things to sort of talk about, okay, how are we going to communicate, how are we going to zone the waterfront so that the public purposes are going to get balanced against private development interests that want to build buildings there. And DEP came up with a very elaborate set of rules. Everyone signed off, and then the real estate community, everybody. It was a big fight, but everyone sort of agreed at the end of the day that these rules made sense. And they were rules like, I know this is really, I was talking about fires very soon.
It's a long way.
So, there were rules like if you're within 100 feet of the water, the maximum height of your building is supposed to be 55 feet. And there's supposed to be set back a certain amount from the water, not just the harbor walk width, but 100 feet based on the size of your lot. And your lot, you couldn't occupy with a building any more than 50% of your lot. So this was kind of the way DEP went about balancing the public's right of access against the private interest in developing, to keep a low profile around the Boston Harbor, which was traditional, and also wasn't creating these big imposing structures that would cast shadows on the water or dominate the waterfront. They created an exception to those regulations, however, for municipalities. And this is one of the final deals that got cut as these regulations were going through. And they created something called a Municipal Harbor Plan. And you probably all know that word now because there's the Downtown Municipal Harbor Plan that we're all thinking about. The concept of the Municipal Harbor Plan was if a city had a big parcel with a lot of lots on it, if the DEP, think about a zoning ordinance, if the DEP regulations applied across the board, none of the buildings could be higher than 55 feet, they all could only occupy 50% of each of the lots. The municipal harbor planning process was a mechanism by which the cities were given the flexibility with approval by the state to kind of cluster things. So instead of making everything kind of cookie cutter 55 feet, if the municipality wanted to have a bunch of buildings over here that were 300 feet, but it would preserve, say, 70% of the total area as public open space, that would be an equivalent of what the DEP regulations would have required of those sites. And it was a great idea. I think to some degree it worked okay for quite a while. And now it's starting to fall apart because what's happening is people are now cutting private deals basically with the mayor over particular parcels. And so it's no longer an area. It's Don Shafaro, or the developer of the Hook Lobster site, or the developer of 150 Seaport, or whoever's got.
Is that Whiskey Priest?
What?
Is that Whiskey?
That's Whiskey Priest. So Whiskey Priest, for example, this is a good example. Whiskey Priest was a fish shop. There was a lobster shack, and there was another fish place there. I think it became a Chinese restaurant at one point. I can't remember the whole history of it, but they wanted to convert from a water-dependent use on that site to bars in the 1990s. And so they had to go in front of DEP and get licenses for this change in use of those parcels. And because the structures were pre-existing, they were able to use some grandfathering rules, but they were required to build a 12-foot harbor walk around those buildings. They were required to build a landscaped park in front of them, and they were supposed to make a public viewing station on top of the bars so that the public could go up there and look out over the harbor and relax. None of that has ever been done. I don't know if any of you have, not many people hang out there, but the public viewing spot as you go down a service corridor that is mostly fire escape, and you crawl your way up the decrepit stairs, and there you're surrounded on a summer day by 1,000 college-age students, and on a winter day by just a bunch of broken furniture and stuff. So that's not done. The Harbor Walk was never built, and the park is used by, I guess it's Atlantic Beer Garden, for outdoor seating. So that site's been in violation ever since day one. But back to the municipal harbor plan. So what the fight is, we're going to get 10 minutes, and I want you to have questions. What the fight over the downtown municipal harbor plan. So we sued the state for approving the 150 Seaport project. And it's not even so much about that particular project. I mean, people either love it or they hate it. And John Cronin, I guess, is a kind of a patron saint in South Boston. And I think legitimately, I mean, I think he does a lot of good stuff there. But what the state approved there was that he was allowed to build a building 5 times what the DEP regulations would have allowed on that site. And he is being allowed to build a building that occupies 70% of the lot instead of 50%. And to the extent that he's trying to create new open space, he's doing it by building a deck out over the water. So he's basically taking one public use of a water sheet and turning it into another public use of a deck. And so he's not really adding, he's not really taking anything away from himself by doing that. We did a rough calculation that just by virtue of, and again, these are just rough numbers, by virtue of his exemptions, the value of the raw land there at these bars went from, he bought it for $3 million, and the rough estimate of current values was about $26 million with the variance based on other prices, and built out the rough back of the envelope estimates we got are something on the order of $120 million delta in value of the building between what DEP would have allowed as a right as opposed to what he was given. In return, he gave $1.5 million to the Martin Park, which is a great park. It's mostly funded already. His $1.5 million is a drop in the bucket to what both the park needs and in terms of the public detriments he's causing in the site. So he's increased the value of his property by, say, $24 million, just the raw land, and he's returning to the public $1.5 million. So what we're worried about there, beyond that particular site, is this sets a new precedent everywhere. It basically monetizes the waterfront. And it says, okay, you can exceed it by this much, and this is what you'll have to pay, and you don't have to pay much. It has nothing to do with how much you profit by being able to build more than you would ordinarily be allowed to build. It's no connection to anything. It's just whatever deal you strike with the city and the state. With the downtown municipal harbor plan, I know a lot of you are engaged in that. We put in very critical comments about it. I mean, I think, between both projects are bad, at least in terms of what they're doing. The Shelley project, no one even knows what that is, so that's bad. I don't know, it's hard to tell exactly what's happening right now. Whether there are discussions going on between the aquarium and Prudential and Shafaro, I don't know. They say they are, but so we haven't seen anything. The difference, what the harbor planning process is supposed to do is supposed to create a municipal vision for an area, and then put projects out to bid. Here's what we want to do there. Who wants to come in? Or it's like a zoning ordinance. You don't get to write your own zoning code for your lot. This is the code. You can maybe go to get a variance for some small change to it, but you can't blow it out of the water. The way this municipal harbor planning process has finally settled down is that it's being used just to create horrible exceptions to these regulations that are meant to protect our legitimate right to be on those properties. The other thing that people do, and something in the fire discussion reminded me of this, think it was about the gates or something. I don't know, someone was bringing it up about the gates. Developers are really clever. A lot of these developments along the waterfront have fairly significant public benefit requirements. But developers and operators of these facilities are very clever in masking them so that you as a member of the public, I'm really sure, am I really allowed to go in this lawn on Fan Pier? It looks very nice, and there are security guards walking along, and so they masquerade these public spaces in a way that really is intended to create ambiguity in people's mind, because they know that if people are uncertain, they're not going to take their kids up onto a lawn or park them down for a picnic or do something like that if they're going to get kicked off. It just doesn't happen. Everyone knows that. A lot of buildings have required 24-hour-a-day restroom facilities. The sign typically is about that big, and it's usually locked. You can go over to the hotel on the other side in Charlestown over there. We went over there a couple times and asked them to go into the bathroom, and they refused. They said, "Can't." And we brought out the license, and they said, "What's that?" They didn't even know what the license was. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I'm really glad that you guys are engaged in this, because you have a right to be engaged in this. It really is going to affect the quality of life. The north end, I think, needs to be connected to the rest of the waterfront. This was the heart of the waterfront back originally, and there are very few places left where we can do really great public spaces on the waterfront. And so it's really important for community organizations to join the fight to try to make as many of those things happen as possible. The mayor is the mayor. He wants tax base. It's a simple equation. I got schools to pay, I got police, I got all this stuff. Waterfront, that's a state. The state deals with that. So the more I can get tax base, affordable housing, every time he puts in one of these buildings here, he gets to build 20 units somewhere. It's not clear where they're all getting built. When the waterfront was being planned back in the 80s, the notion was it was going to be a mixed income community. It was going to be developed as neighborhoods. That was really a wonderful plan, and it's all gone to pot. But anyway, let me stop there. We're available to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much for your pitch. I do have some membership materials here. If you have questions during this municipal harbor planning process, we're waiting now for the state. The city has submitted its downtown municipal harbor plan. It appears to be illegal on its face from our perspective. We've told the state that. The state is negotiating something with somebody, and at some point they're going to either ship it back to the city, or more likely, because the governor needs the support of the city politically, there'll be some compromise that they'll agree to. And then the question is, are we going to get another chance to comment on it before it gets approved? And that's a really critical question that I can't answer right now.
Now, the municipal harbor plan that you're talking about runs from the Mobley Bridge to Long Wharf, is that correct?
Yes.
But and there's
Yeah.
another planning process that's just being initiated that runs
On the other
from
side.
Long Wharf through Commercial Lewis, and I don't know how far
It's
down it
just
goes.
started, I think.
It's just,
There's a municipal harbor plan through the north end?
it's just been noticed.
Well, and one of the things that's really important for you all, not just the Lewis Wharf and the hotel, wherever you're. The last time I was in this building, it was a really interesting evening of a lot of fireworks when there was a public hearing about that building. But the council-elect was talking about these public spaces. The parking lot, again, I don't know how this affects you, plus or minus, but the parking lot that's on the north side of the pilot house.
Sergeant's
Wharf. That's a BDP. That is a public space, and every parking lot is in play. I mean, there's no parking lot that's going to stay a parking lot these days. So it's very important that you get engaged so that you get what you're entitled to as a community in terms of public spaces. You've got some nice stuff up here, you know, up by Charlestown. You got some nice green space. You got some places where people actually go out and play bocce. I mean, they use it, you know, but it's not enough. And so there are a couple of spaces that are in this planning district that are going to be really important for people to focus on and not take any BS from the city office about what they have to do or not have to do. This is a state decision, not the city. And so, and you have rights in that land, so you should certainly try to advance them.
Can you repeat that again? Is there a municipal harbor plan that's going to be, go from?
There's one, it's I don't know where that, it's starting at Long Wharf and goes up to,
I'm not sure how far it goes, probably up to the Coast Guard station.
yeah, I can get Victor some information on it, yeah, yeah.
There's,
And then, yeah, right, yeah,
Yeah, I need to know about that.
yeah, okay.
yeah. And my sense, I went to a couple of meetings of the prior planning process for, and I stopped going because I thought they were a charade.
They were a charade.
And they canceled so many of the meetings, I just stopped going.
Yeah.
During the day.
Yeah. No,
And it just seemed to me a way to justify, as you put it, the permitting
Right,
of very large projects in a couple of selected, well, 3 or 4 selected areas.
right. No, that's exactly what it was. And, you know, it's infuriating to me because people put a lot of time into missed meetings, into going to meetings,
Yeah.
into answering questions, into putting issues in front of the, at that point, the BRA. I mean, one of the fundamental structural problems in Boston is that the principal development agency is also the principal planning agency, and guess who's got clout within that schizophrenic agency? It's not the planning side. There are actually some good planners in that group, but you know, it all comes down to tax base. And so, you know, if a developer comes in and says, "I want to build there," all the plans just go out the window.
Have you thought about what you'd like to see down here on the waterfront? Have you guys thought about that at all? Do you have any ideas?
There have been a lot of, actually, the Bar Foundation commissioned a very interesting study of different kinds of green spaces and, you know, for me, the thing I'm sort of obsessed with at the moment is I've been to a lot of cities and a lot of waterfronts, and there's almost always places where you can have picnics. You know, there's like a fire, you know, there's in the middle of San Francisco, there are places where you can go and take your family and spend the day and roast hot dogs or whatever you want. And there's you know, sign up for things and or there's sports places. East Boston's got a field over there. When you think about the harbor from your place over here, I forget what that park was called. But
Christopher Columbus Park?
Christopher Columbus. No, the other side. Up, Pablo Park. Okay, from there, you just visualize the whole waterfront and find the next place where you would feel comfortable taking your family to go play a big game of Frisbee or something like that. You know, Christopher Columbus Park is about as good as it gets around the whole inner harbor, and that's a very tightly managed. I mean, it's beautiful, it's nice, people do feel comfortable, you can see them just hanging out there for weddings, all that stuff is really what it should be. You go over to Seaport, it's all sterile lawns. You know, it's just like, it's horrible. And so there are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of design firms who actually have some really neat ideas about what could happen, and hopefully we can bring some of that stuff forward into the planning process to give you some ideas. But that's, I mean, I'm all about grandchildren at this point, so you know, there are very few places you can bring your grandchildren to work. I mean, the Harbor Walk is great, but the subliminal message is there, keep walking. You know? That's it's not a harbor sit, it's a harbor walk, and so. Yeah.
Here you described from the Reedy skating rink all the way to the end of Poplar Park, the city's planning to spend millions of dollars to renovate that and improve that whole piece.
For recreational purposes, that's wonderful.
Untouchable, the houses are in there, just so you know.
Yeah. One of the, this is just a very side story. This harbor cleanup was, I mean, it was a sewer, and the scientists, when we started, said it was going to take decades for wildlife to return to the harbor because it was so contaminated. And the first sighting of a harbor porpoise was from that park. Someone called us and said, hey, I was just out there and I swear I saw a porpoise. And it was a porpoise chasing herring up against the dam. And so it's, we can't give up on these areas. And we can't give in, I think, to the economic drivers. I'm really happy to hear that the luxury market's slowing down. Because we do need to take a break and do some planning and put some other things in place. Right, you got your counselor, you can talk to the mayor, or me, you can make demands. I think that's the difference, you just have to make demands. No one makes demands better than the North End, so I mean, it's just, you know, you have a right to be on these areas. They're not, as I said, they're not pure private property, so it's not like you're taking anything away from anybody. All you're doing is you're trying to get what you are already owed. And you really need to go into those conversations understanding that and coming from that place, that they're taking from you, not the other way around. Although that's the way it feels when you're in the room.
So if this is in process, is there a website that we can go to see, or you just have to?
I don't think it's up yet. I don't think it's up yet on the EPA. One of the things we're trying to do in our lawsuit, by the way, against Cronin is to kill the whole harbor planning regulation, to knock it out and to start over again, which would have the DEP regulations apply until a new regulation. That might be years before we get to the courts, but that's sort of our goal, is this thing's broken, let's get rid of it. And
What you're working on, would that...
it would apply everywhere. It would knock out the whole regulation, yeah.
And it's supposed to be pretty delayed until this is solved?
No, they're going to try and get their permit, but we'll challenge that. So, you know, again, it's more so than that particular site, which I think people either love or hate, is the precedent. Because, you know, once you monetize it at such a low level, it's gone. And so.
You're amazing.
Thank you. You all are very supportive.